Yeah, I saw that you were doing it, but then I was like, something's up. I guess they switched it.
Yeah, I think there was a guy who had backed out on whether or not the riots were justified or something, and they're doing one tonight on it was Destiny and something or something like that. I don't remember.
Let's see.
All right, it looks like we're live. I think we are. So, Dry Apologist, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your channel before we get started?
All right, yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So I have a channel, Jar Apologist. I host some discussions kind of like this and post some arguments here and there. So that's pretty much it.
Very cool. So my position is that there is no evidence for the existence of a God. I'm an atheist, and so could you tell me some of the evidence that you believe there is for a belief in a God? And I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons and like to discuss it from there.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a pretty big, I think a lot of the arguments have flaws, but I'm a pretty big fan of like contingency type, or sometimes it's called like vertical cosmological arguments as opposed to like horizontal Kalam types. So,
What's a vertical plumb?
right. Oh, just like how the Kalam is more like horizontal, like it goes back in time. So just using that kind of analogy, while like a contingency is like here and now, or like a Thomistic argument's more like here and now, like what's causing everything. So sometimes that gets called like vertical causality. So it's like what's causing things to exist as opposed to like going back in time. Does that make sense?
Not exactly.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's fine, but it's just like an analogy. It's kind of like, so if you say like take something like contingent, and like you could say like, well, what's causing that to exist, and like what's causing that to exist? It's all like here and now, so it's more like a top-down like chain of causes rather than like going back like a chain of dominoes. It's more like rungs on a ladder. So it's just like an analogy.
So what is like the vertical version of the Kalam argument?
No, no, I was saying a vertical like a contingency as opposed to a kalam, which is more like a horizontal.
Oh,
Again, it's
oh,
just
gotcha.
an analogy. Yeah. Yeah, there's no vertical kalam. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, we talked about this or debated about a version of this a while back. I change my arguments a lot though. So right now I like this version. I just posted a video of it, but I call it the depth argument. So I'm sure you'll have some critiques, but it's a pretty simple argument. And then it's just two premises and a conclusion. So first premise is the deepest, possible dimension of reality must be the ground of reality. And by dimension, I just mean a portion of reality, or you could say a possible thing. But I think dimension is clearer than saying thing. And I said the deepest possible dimension must achieve maximal properties. So it'd just be fleshed out. So it'd be maximal presence, power, intelligence, and empathy. And then the conclusion is that the ground of reality must be maximal in presence, power, intelligence, and empathy. And then by God. So just to kind of defend
So could you say
premise
that
one
one
a
more
little bit,
time?
it's sort of like,
Could you say that one more time so I can
yeah,
just write it
sure.
down?
Yeah, sure. So the deepest possible dimension of reality must be the ground of reality. And this would work even if reality is totally contingent. So by contingent, I just mean like modally contingent, like could have been otherwise. At least that's what I'm arguing. So the deepest possible dimension of reality must be the reality. And then must achieve maximal presence, power, intelligence, and empathy. And then the conclusion is, therefore, the ground of reality must achieve maximal presence, power, intelligence, and empathy. And then that's just what I mean by God.
Okay, so the first premise there, that assumes there is a deepest dimension. There may not be. It may be an infinite regress. There's no logical contradiction there. But if we assume, for the sake of argument, that the deepest dimension is essentially like the ground of reality, those would essentially be synonyms. So, but why do you assume those must have any kind of maximal properties?
Right. So those kind of go hand in hand. So, like, I imagine that something like if I'm conceiving of what the ground of reality would be, like a final stopping point, it seems like that would be something that's maxed out, at least in my mind. So, and you can object to that, but that would, in my mind, it would be like something like you're hitting like the final wall of being. Like that's just, you can't go any further because it's just maxed out. And also symmetrically, something that is maxed out would be the final stopping point. So if somebody said, well, it could go on forever, I would say, well, not if it hits this maxed out ground of being, and that maxed out ground of being would have all these attributes. So they kind of go hand in hand, but that's where those intuitions are coming from.
I don't really understand the presumption that the ground has to be maximal in any sense. Like, I don't think there's any reason to think that it has to have any properties other than just it exists.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's an intuition, so we may just have a conflicting intuition there. But if it just existed and say like it could achieve further presence, like that would seem like that would be a deeper possible dimension that it could take on. Or if there was like facts that it could know outside of itself, that's, or like some sort of conscious experience, that a possible dimension that it could take on, or further power, or psychological features like empathy. These would be deeper possibilities that it could acquire that it hasn't acquired. So it would be a deeper possible dimension that it could encompass but hasn't, is where that intuition's coming from.
Well, I think that when you're trying to establish which direction is deeper and which direction is less deep, that seems kind of arbitrary. Like, for example, we could say the deepest level of reality could be all the things you described, but that just seems to be one arbitrary set of properties, and it could just be a different set of properties, and that's the deepest level. Like, for example, when someone says that evil is like the privation of God or whatever, I could just say that the same thing about the nature of reality. Well, the most deepest level of reality is like the spaghetti monster, the flying spaghetti monster, and anything that isn't the flying spaghetti monster isn't the deepest level because it's the privation of the flying spaghetti monster, essentially. So it seems like you could define the deepest level of reality to be whatever you want if you don't have any specific evidence for these properties being the deepest level.
Yeah, I mean, it's based on a conceptual analysis, and again, we may just have a disagreement there, but to me, if I'm thinking of the flying spaghetti monster, it just doesn't seem like that's the ground of being. Like it's constricted to having like a certain set of noodles and I guess meatballs or whatever it might be. And I could imagine like going a level deeper, and it's like, imagine something like, imagine the noodles extending and there's more noodles, and imagine just going beyond noodleage altogether and beyond meatballish altogether. And like that to me seems just intuitively a deeper dimension. It's like into being noodly and meatballish. And then I would say the same thing with being confined to being like ignorant or lacking empathy. Now I think so that would be where I'm coming from with that. I do think you make a fair point about like evil and goodness. I agree. Like I think defining evil as the lack of good doesn't really help necessarily, but that this argument wouldn't depend upon a privation theory of
Right,
evil.
that was just an analogy. So, but I would say the same
Right.
thing about the Christian God that you said about the spaghetti monster. It seems like, from my perception, intuitively, that consciousness isn't the deepest level. There's far more deeper things than consciousness. So I can get rid of the consciousness and just say it's kind of like a pure energy or pure nature, naturalistic pantheism kind of a thing. And that seems to be a deeper than a theistic kind of a God, from my perspective.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, there are deeper levels than our consciousness, right? But that wouldn't entail that the deepest possible level couldn't be conscious. And I would say like any sort of, what I'm arguing is the deepest possible level just has to basically max out in attributes. There are a couple attributes or types of attributes that the deepest possible level just logically, I think, couldn't have. Although in our debate a few months ago, I tried to argue that it would, but I'm willing to grant that like spatial features or like colors, that would, and there may be others, but those would be the two that stand out. That, yeah, like a omnipresent type reality or a ground of reality wouldn't be able to have those features, at least plausibly. But I think all other features seem possible with this deepest possible reality. And if it's constricted or restricted from having those, then it wouldn't be achieving that extra possibility.
Well, can't I just say the same thing about spaghetti? Like, it may not be our conception of spaghetti that it's limited to be the ground of all being, but it could just be some further level of spaghetti that we just don't understand yet, and that could be the ground of all being.
Yeah, I mean, you could, but then it's like, are we just using the word spaghetti to describe something that we don't really mean by spaghetti? Like, I could call a house a car, but it's like, am I just playing with words or
Right.
like,
It's like magical spaghetti or supernatural spaghetti. So it wouldn't be this physical kind, but the same thing seems to apply to the God kind of a case. Because when we talk about consciousness, we're talking about something that's in space time, something that has thoughts, that's pretty much in a brain as far as we can tell. And so when you're talking about not that and adding consciousness, well, you're kind of doing the same thing I am with the magical spaghetti. You're just amending a new property to what we already know of as consciousness.
right? Well, whether God is in time or not is a question I'm willing to set to the side because I think it could be argued either way. But the idea that like consciousness has to be a part of a brain, I think that seems true for humans. But well, I mean, I'm willing to grant that could be true for humans, but I don't know if that's strictly like logically the case. Like,
Oh yeah, right,
doesn't
right.
seem to be a
I totally
logical.
agree. I totally agree. So, but I'm saying
Yeah.
the same thing is true
Okay.
of spaghetti. It's not logically the case that spaghetti must be physical. It can have non-physical properties just the same way consciousness can. So it seems like you can make the same argument for a non-physical consciousness being the ground of reality for some, just because it's intuitively the case for something. You can make the same argument for spaghetti. It doesn't seem to be like there's any like way to differentiate between the imaginary things we can make up for what the ground of reality must be like. It just seems like we're making up different imaginary ideas of what it must be like. And unless we have some kind of way to differentiate imagination from reality to actually determine one or the other, to lean one way or the other, then it doesn't seem like there's any reliable reason to conclude that your model is any more reasonable than the spaghetti monster model.
Sure. So what if I granted then that the ground of reality is also magical spaghetti? Like I would be okay with that if it's undefined. So then what?
So I'm essentially using magical spaghetti. I could create a definition of it in any way I want. I could just say it's a non-physical. Take the physical composition of spaghetti, make it supernatural and existing outside of space time, and then you have it's just those molecules, but they're outside of space time and they exist supernaturally. I can give you that definition of non-physical spaghetti or something.
All right. Well, I mean, if spaghetti has such like a flexible definition, I mean, yeah, you could argue just like, it was brought up when we talked before, like, could God be maximally fuzzy or something like that? And I was like, sure. I mean, if fuzziness has this sort of looser, more generic variety, I wouldn't have a problem with it. It just seems like that's not what we mean by fuzzy or spaghetti. But if
Right,
you if
right.
you want to argue, yeah. But if
Well,
you want to
I
argue,
want to, sorry to jump in, but I'm not
oh, it's
arguing for
fine.
just a fuzzy definition here. I'm saying we're going to imagine it has a concrete definition. Obviously, I just made it up, so it doesn't have one yet. But we could amend a concrete, like very specific definition to what non-physical supernatural spaghetti is. And like, for example, just say it's the particles, the same exact configuration of spaghetti in matter, but it's just supernatural kind of a matter or something like that. So it has a very concrete thing. It must be this thing. And we could say that this new thing we've just made up is the ground of reality. So I'm not trying to just use a fuzzy definition here. I'm saying we
Right.
could impart.
Right. Right. By fuzzy, I meant like the actual property of like, oh, that's like fuzzy carpet. So I didn't mean that you were using it
Oh,
like
gotcha.
evasively. But yeah, I mean, well, how would you define matter though? Like I would define matter as something like within space at least. But if you're going to use it in this more general, like, maybe argue that it's aspatial. Okay. I mean, is that what you're suggesting? Like there's like this aspatial kind of matter that makes up spaghetti or?
Sure, yeah. So a couple of the many of the theories in quantum mechanics have uh, certain types of matter that exist outside of our space-time.
Sure. I mean, yeah, that would be fine. Like, I'm not strict about words. Like, if somebody wanted to say, okay, well, God's material, but that means he's outside of space and it's like a different kind of material. I mean, I would be fine with that as long as we're conceiving as it's a maxed out being. I mean, I wouldn't think of matter that way, but it's more of getting at the general features.
Well, what I'm saying is that when we define maxed out, it seems pretty arbitrary. We can define it any way we want. And like spaghetti, for example, and not saying, trying to distinguish God, the God that you believe in, from something else, just insert a different God. Like naturalistic pantheism would be essentially eternal, all powerful nature, no consciousness, no omnibenevolence, just those two or three properties, eternal, all powerful nature. And then the spaghetti monster, for example, it would have the property of spaghetti in addition to all of the other theistic kinds of properties. So it would be like it has the omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnipotence, eternal, all-powerful, personal, and made of spaghetti. So it's just adding in another property to God. And it seems like either one of those ways we could go, or we take away the properties of a theistic God and just use eternal, all-powerful nature, or if we add one like spaghetti, either one of those could be argued to be this grounding, ultimate, deepest level. It doesn't seem like there's any actual evidence to support any of these three cases as being the actual deepest. It just seems like we're arbitrarily labeling it as such.
So when you talk about, and I've heard you talk about naturalistic pantheism before, are you imagining it as this kind of aspatial realm, or is it just like a stand-in word for whatever? Like, I'm just wondering how you're conceiving of naturalistic pantheism. I know you listed its attributes, but on the spatial aspect, do you imagine it as something spatial or aspatial?
Oh no, I use the physics models that are outside of our space-time for this specifically. So it's specifically meant to be outside of space-time.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and I would be fine with that in terms of some of the ground of reality, because I would agree, like intuitively, that does make sense. But then I would say, but if this naturalistic pantheism doesn't achieve consciousness and other psychological features, that there's some extra, ontology that it's not achieving. And I know that you're looking at it like, well, the ontology of consciousness and, the psychological attributes.
What do you mean? Because you said it's not achieving those things?
Well, I'm saying in your view, in your naturalistic pantheism view, the ground of reality would not be achieving those attributes, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, it doesn't have them. I don't know what achieving, like, it sounds like it's
Right.
a goal.
That's what I mean.
So,
Right. Well, that's just what I mean. Like, it's this deeper possibility that now I'm arguing it's a deeper possibility, but it doesn't take on that possibility.
why? Why is that a deeper possibility? Why count? Because, for example, like we'd say the sun is a deeper possibility of hydrogen atoms. If we add a bunch of hydrogen atoms, we get the sun. But that seems kind of arbitrary. Really, it's not. Like the hydrogen on its own is sufficient. The sun isn't a deeper property. It's just an emergent property. And I see consciousness as the same thing. So naturalistic pantheism can explain consciousness as an emergent property of matter. And that seems sufficient. I don't think the basal level, the deepest level of reality doesn't itself need to be conscious for any reason, as far as I can tell.
Well, I would say that like molecules are the sun, essentially. But if you want to say there's this extra feature that comes about, like sun feature or whatever, okay. I mean, and again, I'm fine.
Agree. So I would say that consciousness is also the matter, just like the sun is the particles.
Okay. Yeah, I would have a different intuition there, because I do think there's something, and I'm not arguing like substance dualism necessarily here, but just I would argue that there is an extra feature, unless you're going to be, I guess, like a reductive physical. Like, what is your exact view on theory of mind? Like, or maybe you don't have one. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm definitely a physicalist, so I think that consciousness is an emergent property of physical states in the brain and nothing more.
Right. So would you be like an emergentist or like identity theorist, or do you have a set view on that? Or
I don't know enough about those positions to know exactly. I just know that it's purely, I'm 100% naturalist, 100% physicalist. There is no anything but the natural world as far as I can tell, and consciousness is just an emergent property of those things.
Okay.
So I would go with like the consensus in neurology on that.
Okay. So yeah, we'll just say broadly emergentist. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I would be fine with that theoretically as a theory of mind, except for, I'm going to say, any extra property is maxed out in the ground of reality, unless there's a logical contradiction in the ground of reality having that. So like if you say, is the ground of reality blue? I mean, maybe, but to me, that just doesn't seem possible with a spaceless existence. But consciousness, it doesn't seem like there is a contradiction. So it seems like it could take on that extra feature.
Well, it seems like it could have lots of properties, just infinitely many of them in that case. Like if it doesn't have a logical contradiction, if that's the only requirement, it could have a specific length. It's exactly 3 feet long, and that wouldn't be a contradiction. Or it could have a weight, or it could have multiple personalities. That's a trait it could have. It could have all kinds of just list. It could be fat. It could be ugly. It could be stupid and silly. It could be changing from time to time would be a certain kind of trait. It could be in time or out of time, which you already said that was not in your view, that it was out of time, so that's fine. But there's just infinitely many traits it could have, and it seems like, for example, if we just take the length example, if it's 2 feet long, that would make it a contradiction to be 3 feet long and 2 feet long at the same time. But at 2 times, it could be 2 feet long at one point in time and 3 feet long at another point in time, or something along those lines. You have an infinite amount of spectrum of what this thing could be like just in that one property. Like, what is the length of it, if none, if infinite, whatever. So it doesn't seem like the logical impossibility or contradiction gives us any idea of why this would actually be the case. We could just make up anything we wanted to and say that's what the properties are.
Yeah. Now, well, you use the example of length. Now, to me, that seems something like a spatial feature, unless you're going to argue for this looser, kind of like with the magical spaghetti property. Like, I would agree the ground of reality can't be 3 feet long. It can't be 2 feet long. It doesn't have length. So it can't be fat either. It can't be skinny. It can't be, any of these spatial kind of features. I would say, like, whether it's naturalistic pantheism or theistic ground of reality, I would say, yeah, it doesn't have those properties, but there were a few others.
But wait, why is that? What is the logical contradiction there? Because you said it could have any property as long as there wasn't a logical contradiction. It should have that property to the extreme or whatever. So there doesn't seem to be any logical contradiction with it being 2 feet long.
Right. Well, the logical contradiction would be something that's aspatial and 2 feet long.
Well, remember, it doesn't need to be aspatial.
But I thought naturalistic pantheism, you said, was aspatial.
Oh yeah, I make that assertion. It doesn't need to be. It's not like a requirement at
right.
all. But
okay. I thought that was the alternative model you were working with.
It's just one of the examples. So, like, my argument is that when you claim that there is this deepest level, and this deepest level has had these exact sets of properties, I could pick something with less properties and say this is the deepest level, like naturalistic pantheism, or I could pick something with more properties, like the spaghetti monster, and say this is the deepest level. So I'm not specifically arguing for naturalistic pantheism at this point. I'm just trying to figure out why you think these sets of properties are required for the deepest level, because it seems like we could just say whatever we wanted was the deepest level. There's no evidence to indicate this one thing over the others. And your follow-up argument to that was that it seems to be the case that the deepest level has the maximal traits as long as it's not logically contradictory, which I don't think that addresses my original point. I don't see that gives us evidence towards any of these three over the other. But if that was the case, then there's another problem, which is the fact that there's lots of properties it could have that aren't logically contradictory.
Right. So when we can get to those, but first I want to say that, okay, so there's two facets here. One, so I'm starting with the conceptualization of what something that achieves the deepest possible, or I know you push back on that, but attains or whatever, it is the deepest possible reality. I'm starting with the intuition would be that would be an aspatial type of thing. So I agree with you in the sense when you bring up naturalistic pantheism as an alternative, and if you're going to say, well, that's an aspatial alternative, I agree that initially that is a plausible conceptual alternative. But if you're going to say, well, it's something spatial, like a 3 foot long stick, I would say, well, no, that doesn't seem very plausible. It's got to be aspatial as our starting point, because anything that's spatially confined, I can conceive of something going an extra dimension that breaks out of that spatial confinement. But then, so that's where I'm going to rule out things like 3 feet long, 2 feet long, and so on. But if we want to then look at other attributes and say, well, what about these other attributes that don't seem logically contradictory? I would say, okay, well, let's look at those.
But wait, because your argument said it has to be logically contradictory, because if it's not, then it should have this property. And the length isn't logically contradictory. You just said it doesn't seem like it has that property.
It's logically contradictory if we grant that the ground of reality is aspatial and like that's omnipresent.
Right, but that goes back to my original argument, is like, why do you think that is the case? Do we have any evidence that this is the case?
Okay, so yeah, this is where I think we're going to disagree. So you say you have any evidence that's the case. Now, I assume you're asking for empirical evidence, right?
Well, I define evidence as that which can differentiate between imagination and reality. I use empirical evidence as the way to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where our main disagreement is. I think that it seems like you come from it more from an empiricist epistemology, and I come from it more from a rationalist epistemology, just in the sense that I'm working more with conceivability and conceptualization as my starting point when examining a metaphysical claim. And it seems like you're starting with, well, show me the tangible empirical data, and then we go from there. Would you agree? Like, is that a fair way to categorize?
Well, that would definitely describe our worldviews, but I'm not approaching the debate from that perspective. Because my question to you is, I'm asking you, what is your evidence for the existence of God? And would you agree that evidence is something that can differentiate between imagination and reality?
Not necessarily, and that's where I think that we disagree. So if you're saying, where is my empirical evidence, and what empirical evidence do I have, then it seems like, okay, yeah, I haven't brought any.
Well, no, I'm not asking that. I'm not specifically saying empirical evidence. So I define evidence as that which can differentiate imagination from reality. Would you agree with just that statement? Nothing about empiricism.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I might have a hang up with it, but yeah, it sounds fine.
So I'm asking you is, because the only method I know to do that is empiricism. That's my worldview. But if you know of a different way to do that, because you essentially agree with the definition in general, what is your way of doing that you provide as evidence that gets you to that conclusion?
Right. So I would say, yeah, starting with a plausible conceptualization, and if it, all things being equal, if that's a plausible conceptualization, it seems intuitively correct, and denying it seems less intuitively correct, then I think I wouldn't say it's like definitive proof, but I would say that that gives me plausible reason. So, for example, just to distinguish this argument from, say, like the ontological argument, I don't think the ontological argument works. And the reason why I bring it up is because I think it's purely working with a conceptualization, but it has what I call a bridge problem. So how do you get from this is how God is defined to actually connecting that with concrete reality? But with this argument, it is connected with concrete reality. So because it has this aspect, I'm starting with reality, and then I'm saying, well, what's the deeper reality? And then I am bringing in intuition and conceptualization. But I think those are legitimate tools to use when navigating metaphysics. Like, I'm not going to be able to bring empirical data. It's going to be impossible. But I don't rule out intuition and conceptualization to narrow down beyond that. I think, that can give enough plausibility.
So you said your criterion was that it has to have a coherent conceptualization?
Well, that would be one of it, yeah.
Because that doesn't seem to be able to differentiate imagination from reality as far as I can tell. Because I can have a coherent conceptualization of a unicorn. I mean, unicorns definitely aren't logically contradictory. Just pink horses with horns on their heads or whatever. It seems like based off of that definition, it's just as long as it's logically possible, then that essentially is your basis of evidence of it existing in reality.
Well, no, not conceiving of it on its own wouldn't be. So like, that's why I reject the ontological argument, because I think it just gives you a definition. But if you have a definition and you can show that definition, or that, I like conceptualization better. If you can show that conceptualization has a connection to the concrete world, whether it's a causal connection or just an ontic connection, and it would entail an implausibility to deny that ontic connection, then I think that's going to lead to, I think that is sufficient evidence in my mind. So just imagining a unicorn doesn't tell me a unicorn exists. But if I could show there's a contradiction in a unicorn not existing, given other intuitive considerations about reality, then that would be sufficient evidence. But I don't have an argument for that for a unicorn.
So your criteria is a conceptualization plus a connection to reality. What do you mean by a connection to reality?
Connection to concrete reality. So returning to this argument, just so I can flesh this out a little bit. So the deepest possible dimension must be the ground of reality. So to me, that's a conceptualization, but it's also ontically connected with what exists, because, I use this example of like floors in a building. A lower floor must exist in order to support the higher floors. But then I work from there to say, okay, well, what would a deeper possible dimension look like? And I'm going to argue that it has to take on all conceivable properties, because if it didn't, it's going to entail a contradiction that there are possible ontic features that aren't achieved or aren't subsumed into the deepest possible reality. So I'm also working with the law of non-contradiction. Now, I know we probably have a different or disagreement on how the law of non-contradiction applies to reality, but that's also what I'm working with.
So I'm not sure what you mean by a connection to concrete reality, because it seems like the connection is just an analogy. You're making an analogy to floors and saying the deepest thing is kind of like the lowest floor. Is that all you mean by a connection, just an analogy to something in reality?
Um, yeah, kind of. I'm just saying, like, the lower floors, in a sense, causally support the higher floors. But if somebody was a skeptic about causality, for
Oh, no,
example,
no, no, right, right. I'm granting that part, but I'm saying that, for example, we could use an analogy of something else. We use the analogy of a domed structure, and the support comes from the top, like a crane. It's really actually coming from top down instead of bottom up. We could use a different analogy. What makes this analogy to floors, or something like just floating in space? Like, for example, the sun is floating in space. Nothing is supporting it. So we can, instead of using an analogy of a building with floors, we could use the analogy of the sun floating in space. And it seems like just the fact that there is an analogy uh, as a connection to concrete reality doesn't work, because you can have contradicting connections, like the analogy of the building or the analogy of the sun.
right. Well, the reason why I think the analogy of the sun breaks down is because they're in the sun, there it isn't capturing when we're thinking about dimensions, or well, I use the word dimensions, but fundamental components of reality. So like matter is more, I would say, more fundamental than the objects it makes up. And like, and that's just in a loose sense. Or like laws of physics are more fundamental than the matter, and so on. So when we're conceptualizing and analyzing what it means for something to be fundamental to something, a sun floating in space doesn't really capture that. So it would be, I think, an improper analogy. Now, your crane analogy, I think, is closer, because in there is this kind of causal connection. So that's the difference. Now, with the crane analogy, I'm fine with that. It just doesn't capture what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about something being more fundamental than something else. But if you want to use the crane analogy, I mean, that's fine. I just don't think it captures the intuition.
Well, remember, I'm just trying to meet the criteria you've presented so far. So the two criteria you have is conceptualization and a connection to concrete reality via analogy. And
Well, and the laws of logic, so like law of
right, right,
non-contradiction.
yeah, absolutely, I grant that too. So um, based off of that, we could create three conceptualizations with a connection to concrete reality. One is the conceptualization of a building going down. One is the conceptualization of a star floated in space, and the other one is the connection of a crane. Each of those meet all of the criteria you've proposed. The difference you said is, well, intuitively to you, it seems more like the building, but that doesn't seem to be a good criterion to differentiate between the two, because intuitively to me, it's definitely not like a building.
Okay.
But would you
Um,
say that any of those three don't meet the criteria you've presented so far? Is there some part of the criteria they don't meet?
so the criteria being laws of logic, conceptualization, and a connection to reality. Yeah, I mean, I would say the sun analogy just doesn't map on to what we're thinking of, or at least what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of fundamental support. So like laws of logic, particles, so on. So I'm thinking about, what's, when we're trying to discover what's fundamental, like the most fundamental, or if there is a most fundamental component of reality, imagining a sun in space is an improper analogy. Now, a crane
Wait, go back
could
for a
work
second.
as,
Go back for how is that different from imagining a building? Because obviously buildings are also made of matter. So I mean, there's definitely a sun on its own is made of matter. So we're not literally thinking the sun is the ground of reality. We're just thinking of the ground of reality is like a sun, in the fact that it just exists as a foundation floated in space with nothing greater or lower than it.
okay. Okay, so I got you there. Yeah, the difference then would be that in that analogy, the sun isn't supporting anything. Now, if you want to expand the analogy and say, okay, well, it is like its gravitational pull is supporting the Earth or so on, then maybe we could flesh out the analogy. But with the sun analogy, you're just talking about a lone object. But with the building analogy, I'm talking about the floors of the building supporting one another. Now, the crane analogy, I think, is closer to that, because there is a causality going on if you're imagining a crane picking up an object or something. But
All right, I'm not
you
trying
see,
to make the same analogy you're making. I'm just using a different analogy. So, for example, Agrippa's trilemma is the statement that all knowledge claims are rested on either circular region, infinite regress, or dogmatism. And I'm thinking of the floor analogy as kind of like an infinite regress. And I just picked the sun as like a foundationalism, dogmatism kind of position. So I wasn't trying to use the same analogy. I'm just saying that we can think of reality as a kind of being supported and there's deeper levels to it. Or we can think of reality as there aren't any deeper levels to it. It's all just kind of a conglomeration of the essence of reality or something like that. So we can use different kinds of analogies to envision the universe in different ways. And it doesn't seem like your particular analogy presupposes that that's the way the universe is based off of your conceptualization. And I can just do the same thing with a different analogy.
Okay, now I get where you're coming from. Okay, so like the sun analogy then could be like a pantheist analogy, or at least that's what I'm thinking of in my mind.
Sure.
Where maybe there is nothing more fundamental and it's just matter in the universe. Okay, so on that, I would say, okay, so then that's where I would bring in conceivability, and I would say, okay, but there could be a deeper possible dimension than the sun, and then that's where we would bring back the building analogy.
Why does the fact that there could be one evidence that there is?
Okay, so, right, so possibility doesn't entail actuality, but I'm arguing that when we're thinking about fundamental connections, as in something being more fundamental than something else, then deeper possibilities do entail actuality.
Because there's that following your reasoning there. Because for me, there's always a possibility of something deeper. Like, for example, I could say that consciousness is fundamental, like an idealist, and say just consciousness is the most fundamental thing in the universe. Or I could say consciousness is an emergent property of matter, or it reduces to physical properties. So it could be deeper that it's material, but that doesn't mean it is. You can't use that as like an argument that follows from the same, because you could do it with literally anything. You could say matter, like atoms are the smallest constituent part of all matter in the universe. Or it could be the case that they're made of gluons. And it could be the case that gluons are made of smaller particles, quarks or whatever, and you keep going down infinitely. There could always be a deeper level. There's no way to say absolutely here is the final level.
Sure. Right. So that's where I'm bringing in the intuition that, well, a maxed out reality, something that's, aspatial, has all these maximal features that would be logically compatible with an aspatial reality, that would be the stopping point, because there just wouldn't be any further to go.
Well, to me, it seems like you've just picked a number and said, this is the biggest number. Like if you say 37 is the biggest number ever and you can't get a bigger number. And I'm like, wait a minute, you could just add 1 to that. So I can take your idea of a God and say, well, that's the 37. And I can just add 1 and say, spaghetti, add the spaghetti. We now have a deeper level of it. So it seems to me like you've arbitrarily chosen a specific set of properties, and I can like add 1, like the spaghetti monster, make it 38, or take 1 away and make it 36, like the naturalist or pantheism. It doesn't seem like the criteria you've presented give us a way to differentiate which one of these is actually the deepest.
Sure. Okay, so working with, like the number analogy, well, what if it's more like infinity? We wouldn't be able to add to infinity, and that's how I'm imagining the deepest possible reality. It's more like infinity than the number 37.
Well, I mean, I understand how you're thinking of it, but we can't actually add to infinites. It's pretty interesting. But the point of my argument is that you imagine this to be the deepest level. You imagine this to be like infinite, but I see no reason in any of the arguments or criteria you've presented to actually get to the conclusion that it is the deepest. As far as I can tell, the spaghetti monster, the 38, could equally qualify as the deepest, or the natural pantheism could equally qualify as the deepest. They all fit your criteria. Your criteria doesn't give us a way to differentiate between these two things. The only thing that you've given that does is like intuitively to you, it seems like this one is the right one.
Right. Yeah. At that point, it is based on an intuition. And I mean, I don't have a problem with that.
Okay. Do you think that's a good reason to believe?
I think it's more plausible than not. So if something matches my intuitions and that seems correct, I mean, ultimately, I think the judgments that we make do come down to our intuition. So like, for example, I know that, or at least from what I've heard, you're a moral realist, and I am too. I think that comes down to intuition, ultimately. I think you make arguments, but ultimately it seems like, I think, and we could use a different example, but it's going to come down to intuition at the end of an argument. And different people are going to have conflicting intuitions, perhaps. And I don't know what to do about that, but
Oh yeah, I would agree. But the way that my epistemology deals with intuition is that it's only good insofar as it leads you to conclusions about your imagination. Like it can't tell you about reality. It can only tell you about things in your imagination, how you conceive of or perceive the world. And so, in the naturalist worldview, there's different levels of evidence. Like empirical evidence is a good way to tell you about things in reality because it can differentiate imagination from reality. But there's other kinds of evidence like math and logic and intuition and stuff. Those don't. They on their own cannot differentiate between imagination and reality. They're good evidence for imaginary things. Like if I tell you I'm imagining a unicorn, that's great evidence I'm imagining a unicorn. But it would not be evidence that a unicorn exists in reality. So intuition is good evidence in certain cases, just like eyewitness testimony is good evidence in certain cases, but it doesn't apply as evidence for all cases. You can't use intuition to justify like the foundation of ultimate reality. You could justify it to justify what you think is right about morality or what you think is in that box or how much you think it weighs or whatever. Those are perfectly reasonable conclusions to get based off of intuition. But the foundation of reality or when is Donald Trump going to be impeached? Those are not things you could judge based off of intuition.
so okay, so a few points there. When you talk about objective morality, and it sounds like you're thereby saying it's just a part of your mind. Is that right?
It's an abstract concept. So I think that like math and logic, a perfect triangle, all those things are conceptual abstracts. And I think morality is also a conceptual abstract.
Right, and I basically agree with that. So I would say, okay, but I just want to be clear because like it seems like that does apply to reality, but I understand that it's different because it's not a concrete thing. But would you say your epistemology then is that intuition allows you to access what is abstractly true about reality? Because I mean, if you're going to commit to objective morality, it seems like that is about reality in some sense, right? But it just wouldn't be concrete. Would that be fair?
Well, abstract means doesn't exist in reality.
Well, it depends upon how you define abstract, but I would say concrete would be something that's like causally interactive with reality, and abstract would be something that's like an acausal feature of reality. But it depends upon how you parse out the words. But I
Right.
just
So,
asked because I'm
so
just curious.
I'm using the philosophical definitions, math, logic, those things as abstracts are just languages like English. We make them up in our head. They don't exist in reality. They're not features of reality at all. They just describe reality. So morality is the same thing. It describes a feature of reality, but it's just a language like any other language, like math and logic.
Okay. And then my other point is that so the reason why I have this strong intuition that the ground of reality would have these maximal features. So I know earlier you said, well, we can add to infinity, and I'm not going to debate that point. I don't know, but it does seem though that if something is totally decked out in properties and there literally is nothing else to add to it, then it seems like that would be the final stopping point of possible reality. Like there just is nothing else there is no other feature that could be beyond that. Like to me, it does seem contradictory.
All right, I understand your argument, like saying that there is a thing that has all the maximal properties. Like that's not a logical contradiction. Yeah, I understand that as a concept, but what those properties are, whether or not this accurately defines reality, because it may have the least or the minimization of all properties instead of the maximization of all properties. There could be both. There could be both a minimal and a maximal thing, and they're both the fundamental nature of reality. So there's lots of possibilities there, but it seems to me to be the case that you've just asserted this. Like again, I don't see the intuition that you've presented doesn't seem to be a good way to differentiate imagination from reality. It just seems to be a good way to explain why you like to imagine things a certain way. Like the argument isn't, I can use my intuition as a way to express why I imagine this to be the case. Like, okay, but is that a reason to believe it's not imaginary? Well, no, it's just explaining why you imagine it to be the case.
Right. Well, I'm arguing that it seems contradictory to imagine that there are possible features that a maximal ground of reality, a ground of reality that's maximized in attributes, that there are other possible features that it could take on. But so that's why I'm arguing that it would have to be maxed out. But if you say, yeah, but it could be like magical noodles, that they aren't maxed out. Yeah, except that there are deeper possible dimensions more fundamental than the magical noodle, because the magical noodle is not decked out. So it's like, if you go the route of that route, I'm going to say, well, that's not the deepest possible reality. But the other route, if you say, well, sure, that ground of reality is maxed out, but there could be other deeper possibilities, I'm going to say no, because this is a maxed out. It achieves all these deepest possibilities. So to me, it seems logically contradictory. Now, I'm not going to say that, well, if you deny the argument, you're thereby irrational, or it's like a proof. I'm just saying, though, to me, though, it does seem logically contradictory to not ascribe maxed out attributes to the ground of reality.
Right, I understand your argument, but I'm saying, like, if we have 10 different people who all claim 10 different things at the maxed out level of reality, and they all making the exact same argument, how do we differentiate between them to say this one is real and these are the imaginary ones?
Right. Well, I mean, that's like with any philosophical discussion, or really a discussion about anything. People are going to have different intuitions. Now, to me, I think denying this argument does lead to a contradiction, but you may not see it that way. So I'm not going to say, well, you're irrational, you're contradicting yourself. But the way I size it up is, if you're going to say the deepest possible reality doesn't achieve maxed out attributes, and that there would be these possible attributes or dimensions that go beyond it, that it doesn't achieve, like that to me seems contradictory. So to me, like, to deny the argument seems contradictory. I could be wrong about that, but that's where I'm also basing the argument on, is, you know, the law of non-contradiction.
All right, no, I'm granting that for the sake of the argument. I can grant that. Let's just say that whatever the ground of reality is maxed out properties, whatever that is. But unless you can prove which set of properties are the maxed out properties, then it just seems to be arbitrary, and you just picked those and somebody else picked a different set of properties. And there doesn't seem to be, based off of the criteria you've presented, every single one of these people meets every single one of those criteria. That doesn't like actually indicate one or the others. They just have different intuitions. They're all using the laws of logic. They're all using conceptualization. They all have a connection to concrete reality, and they're all using their intuition. They just have different intuitions. Now, to go back, I would say that the idea that the fundamental nature of reality is maxed out properties is a presupposition. Like, I definitely don't share that intuition at all. I think most people don't share that intuition, except like presuppositionalists for the most part. There's no reason to think that there's some set of properties that are maxed out that describes the fundamental nature of reality. It could just be one thing, it's just a quantum particle or whatever. So those would be the two major criticisms I have. Is one is that you seem to be presupposing that the fundamental nature of reality has these maxed out quality to it, that it must have maxed out things, which I don't think is supported by anything. And the next thing is that there's a specific set of properties, and those specific set are the correct set that correspond to reality. And I don't see any reason to think that is the case. They just seem to be like arbitrarily picked based off of your worldview.
Sure. Okay. So a couple of things there. Yeah, I want to make sure I'm not a presuppositionalist at all. I would say that this fits more with like a classical theist type model. Now, I do have some problems with some versions of classical theism, but it conceives God more as the ground of being, or being itself. Now, I'm not a Thomist, but I think Thomists would be largely happy with what I'm saying. But in regards to, so the contradiction, I want to go back to that. The contradiction to me comes from, it's maxed out properties that an aspatial ground of being would have. And that's why if somebody were to say, well, it could just be this particle, I would say, well, no, because the deepest possible reality does have to be omnipresent. It does have to be aspatial. Now, if you say, well, it's a magical particle that's aspatial, well, that's fine, but that's just not what I meant when I said it couldn't be a particle. So that's where the contradiction is. So I just want to make sure that's clear, is that it's an aspatial.
That would only be a contradiction if you grant it's aspatial.
Sure.
And many people don't. Like, it's not logically required that the fundamental nature of reality is aspatial. So there isn't a logical contradiction there unless you grant it's aspatial and then say it's spatial. But you don't need to do that.
Right.
Like a person in my example, a person could just say the fundamental nature of reality is a quantum particle. They're not saying it's aspatial. So there's no logical contradiction there. There's not a logical contradiction in their argument, and it meets all of your criteria, the laws of logic, conceptualization, connection to reality.
Okay. So why I would push back on the particle is because something that's confined by space, I can conceive of a deeper possible dimension that's not confined by space. And that's why I would say a particle Like there will be lots of particles. If I'm imagining the ground of reality, I don't think it's going to be confined by space. So if somebody suggests the ground of reality is something spatial, I find that to be just conceptually just incorrect, which is why I think you argue that it could be naturalistic pantheism. And I agree, without a further argument, it could be. If you're conceiving of naturalistic pantheism as this aspatial dimension, I totally agree, except for naturalistic pantheism as this aspatial realm doesn't achieve these extra psychological features, and that's why it doesn't achieve these deeper possibilities, and that's where the contradiction would come in. So
Right,
that's
but
how
again,
I handle both of
seems
those.
that seems like a contradiction from your worldview, but not from the worldview of the particle guy, because you believe that it has a deeper level. You have this intuition that there is this deeper level beyond the particle. He doesn't have this intuition, so there's no logical contradiction in his worldview. It's not a self-contradiction. It would be like if I said I'm an atheist, therefore you have a logical contradiction in worldview because you believe there's a God and there's no God. I mean, obviously I can't call that a logical contradiction because it's not yourself contradicting yourself. It's a disagreement between the two worldviews. So likewise, the particle guy, he doesn't have a logical contradiction in his worldview because there's no premises in his argument that are contradictory. It's perfectly valid. It's only a logical contradiction because he disagrees with your worldview. And they're obviously they can't both be true because then that would violate the law of non-contradiction. But that isn't a problem because that it's his still meets all the criteria you've presented. It's still coherent with the laws of logic. It still meets a conceptualization, and it still has a concrete connection to reality.
Sure. Right. I mean, it wouldn't be, you're right, it wouldn't be a contradiction for the particle guy. However, to me, that just seems conceptually false because there are things outside of the particle, and there can be things outside of the particle. To call a particle the ground of reality, that just does not capture my intuition about what the ground of reality. If they say, well, I have a different intuition, I think it can. I just think it's reaching an intuitive just kind of brick wall where it's like, well, I just don't share that intuition at all. And we may just part ways at that point, but like a particle being the thing that the final stopping point of all possibility, that just doesn't seem correct to me, which is why I think you argue for naturalistic pantheism as an alternative, because that does seem somewhat plausible. But like a particle being the ground of all reality, that just seems false.
Well, I mean, I argue for naturalistic pantheism just as a counter argument to theism, but yeah. But it seems like to most physicists, the particle argument is actually far more intuitive. So again, the fact that intuition seems to be the leverage point in your argument seems to be not a reliable method to differentiate between imagination from reality, as far as I can tell. That seems like not the greatest method. Like, for example, if we use empiricism, if two people have a disagreement, we can just say, here's the evidence, he's right, he's wrong. It's real simple, cut and dry. Their intuitions don't make a difference. It doesn't seem like the case that using intuition as a basis to conclude truths about the universe is an effective method. It seems like using a broken compass to try and guide yourself, because we know intuition is wrong significantly often. So how would you differentiate between intuition being this one being one of the correct times when it actually works versus one of the incorrect times when it is completely wrong?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, like any argument is going to ultimately be supported by an intuition. So is it possible that I'm wrong? Sure, it's epistemically possible, but I'm still going to go with what I find to be most plausible, which is kind of why I was bringing up moral realism. Like there are some people who, as you know, argue that moral realism just seems false. I don't share that intuition. I don't think you do either. And I know that you made that distinction about like conceptual and abstract, and that being where you apply intuitions. I just don't see why I should restrict it to the mere like a mental quality like moral realism. I just think that any argument is going to be, any philosophical argument at least, is going to be supported by intuition. And to me, this argument seems intuitively correct. If somebody said, well, it could be the particle or whatever, I think that, and I understand like I have the burden of proof in that regard, I just don't share that intuition. So I don't know, because of, I can imagine, not only imagine, but we know there are things outside of a single particle. It just doesn't seem like that's the final stopping point of all, not only all physics, but all possibility. Like that's the final ultimate. That just strikes me as just wrong.
Well, yeah, I just refer you to the physicists who show that mathematically and why they believe that. But again, my argument would be is the reason we would conclude that intuition is only conceptual is because we know how often it fails. Like when we apply intuition to things like quantum mechanics, it fails all the time. It's just everything people believed about it was just completely wrong. Or when people apply their intuition to the shape of the earth, initially it was all wrong. And people apply their intuition to what caused lightning or sound or echoes or volcanoes or storms, tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, everything, every one of our intuitions about anything that wasn't directly related to things nearby us physically, essentially, was always wrong. Our intuition that things are solid was wrong. It's actually just 99% empty space between the proton and the electron. Our intuitions about temperature are wrong. If we touch a plastic object and a metal object, the metal object will feel colder, but it's not. It's just different levels of conductivity, heat conductivity. So it seems like it could be the case that our intuition is wrong so often when it doesn't apply to just conceptual things in our head that it's not a reliable source to use. Kind of like if we know a compass is broken, we probably shouldn't use it as a guide. Like we're not going to use this broken compass to go across the ocean. Now, I agree with you that intuition is an important part of arguments in philosophy, but arguments in philosophy are usually have to do with things in our head. So that's usually not an issue. Since if the conclusion is conceptual conclusion, then of course I'm happy to grant that in my epistemology as valid evidence. It's only not evidence if your argument has something to do about what exists in the world, like the temperature, the tornado, lightning, etc. In those cases, it seems intuition fails at a significantly higher than chance rate. So it gives us a good reason to exclude intuition as a meaningful basis of evidence for conclusions regarding those kinds of things.
Okay, so a couple of things there. So when I would say a lot of the things that you're probably chalking up to, like, well, intuition failed, was more of a secondary or of accidental nature, like, what causes lightning? And maybe somebody had an intuition that it's Thor or something. But to me, that's more of a mechanical type thing. But if we're talking about something leading to a contradiction, that's different. Now, I want to return then to the particle and why it seems contradictory to me, because there are other features that this particle, like other deeper possibilities, this particle could take on, but it doesn't. And to me, that just seems very clear to me. I mean, that's where I'm just like, I get the naturalistic pantheism objection. Like, why is it naturalistic pantheism? But the particle, I just don't, there are deeper possibilities the particle doesn't take on. So it's like calling out the deepest possible dimension of existence is a single particle. It's like, well, what about the other particles? They're not the deepest possible dimension.
Well, it's like, the singularity theory in physics, right? So
vaguely, yeah.
So where everything just comes together into a single particle at the beginning of the Big Bang, and that's the foundational theory of everything.
Well, the foundational theory of like the origin of the universe.
Yeah, some of them, like some of the original ones, were meant to do the theory of everything. Like Hawking's version his goal was to do that with the singularity theory. So that was his idea, was that there's a single particle, a quantum particle that did all of this. And it is the foundation of everything. So that's his intuitive viewpoint about what caused the grounds of reality. So if you had a issue with that, you probably have to take it with him, but that is a common view that existed in physics. So I don't know, and the physicists definitely disagree, and they think that consciousness, personality traits, omni traits, those are not the deepest level of reality. They think of the deepest level of reality as particles because it's what they work with. That's how they think. And so it makes sense that their intuition is going to correspond to particles. But it seems like, I want to go back to that point, that it doesn't seem, we know that you mentioned that you thought intuition was like a secondary thing of why we got the understanding what caused lightning was wrong or something. Like, I don't understand that distinction you're making, because it seems to me like intuition is just, that wasn't intuition. Like, why would that intuition be different from our intuition about the fundamental nature of reality? It seems like it would actually be less plausible that our intuition would be right about the fundamental nature of reality.
Right. Well, that was just an analogy to point out, like, if I have an intuition of like what caused that, event over there, that would be something within the universe, but that would be different if I'm contemplating like what is the ultimate nature of what's most fundamental to reality. So I was just saying analogically they're a little bit different, but I'm not interested in impressing that point too much. But you said something, oh yeah, about the singularity. Yeah, and I'm not going to debate physics. I don't know physics. But to me, though, the singularity, my understanding is that's more about like the origins. Now, I know like Hawking was interested in finding like a theory of everything, but I don't know why that would be incompatible with what I'm arguing.
But it's like saying that God could be created by a greater God, kind of a thing. Like it's not logically contradictory for that to be the case. It could be, but it would be the same thing. The singularity could be created by God would be the exact same thing as saying, well, God could be created by a greater God. In Hawking's model, the singularity is the God. It is the origin of everything. It is the, I forget what the term the preceptors use, that it imbues existence to everything that exists. It sustains the existence of things, kind of a thing. But I'm not really, that's a separate issue. Because again, my main question here that I'm looking for an answer to is that why do you think that the intuition, when it was wrong so many times in history, what is different about those cases than the one you're applying it to here, that we would think that the way you're applying it to is more likely to be correct than than those cases which were all wrong?
All right. Well, I would say that those intuitions weren't based on logical contradictions. Like somebody could have an intuition that Thor caused lightning. But like, what's the logical contradiction for it being something else? But in this case, I think there is a logical contradiction if you don't ascribe maximized properties and aspatiality to the ground of reality. That does seem to be contradictory to me.
Well, they actually did use logical contradiction as a basis for many of these arguments. Like they said that, well, lightning can't be produced naturally, therefore it must be supernatural, produced by a being of some kind, a supernatural being. So they did use logical contradictions in the same way you're using them. It just happened to be the case that we discovered, oh, actually, there is a way that this can be produced naturally. So their argument was an argument from incredulity or God of the gaps. They just said, we don't know what this is the case, therefore it must be God. But instead of saying that, they used a logical contradiction and said, this cannot be the case, therefore God, which seems to be the same thing you're doing, is that you seem to be imposing logical contradiction, say, well, it's a logical contradiction for the base of reality to be any other way than this, which seems to be exactly like what the lightning people were doing when they're saying it was a logical contradiction that lightning could be produced naturally. It was just their assumption based off of their intuitions, which was more a representation of, I can't imagine it being done in any other way, therefore it can't be done in any other way. That seems to be like what your argument is.
Right. Well, I would want to look at those arguments. So like I'm not aware of a deductive argument that attempts to prove lightning based on the law of non-contradiction. And obviously we know empirically that, or excuse me, based from Thor or whatever, based on the law of non-contradiction. But I would imagine there's a flaw in that argument just without looking at the empirical data. So the mere fact that people have used intuition and arrived and maybe even derived it from the law of non-contradiction doesn't mean it was ever a good argument. Now, that's not to say that somebody finds my argument good, but if it is truly a good argument, then I'm interested in looking at it, even if it arrives at an intuitively implausible claim.
Well, there's common examples like consciousness can't come from non-consciousness, life can't come from non-life. Those are the same kinds of arguments where they're saying it's logically impossible for life to come from non-life, or it's logically impossible for consciousness to come from non-consciousness. Those are deductive arguments that make the same conclusion, but there isn't a logical contradiction there at all. It's essentially they're saying, the argument is really an expression of their psychology. They're saying, I can't imagine that this is the case, therefore it's not the case, because they're extending their intuition to apply to reality, when really it's just an expression of their intuition.
Right. Okay. So I think that's a fair point to bring up, because actually I used to find that to be a really convincing argument. So it's like, yeah, you can't get consciousness from non-consciousness, not just because we don't like it, but because it actually does seem like, and I grant that it doesn't, but it seems like it commits a logical contradiction. Like you're getting something, like you can't give what you don't have. And that actually, I think that is logically correct. You can't give what you don't have. However, the argument for consciousness doesn't actually trade on that principle, because like a reductive physicalist isn't arguing that matter's giving what it doesn't have. Rather, it's the principle you can produce, so really it's producing a feature that it doesn't already possess. And there is no logical contradiction in something producing a feature that it doesn't possess. So actually, I think, so that'd be like an argument from proportionate causality. And I would say that, yeah, that is intuitive. However, I think that they're flawed arguments. But if they were logically necessary, I think that they would be good reason to think that. But I don't think they're logically necessary. So that's where I think we have to just really look at the arguments. Now, I get it. Finding empirical data is more satisfying in some ways, but I don't know that it's a necessary requirement.
Well, I'm making the same argument about your argument. It seems like you have defined this as logically necessary, just like they have defined consciousness as not coming from non-consciousness as logically necessary. You can say that about anything. You can say, well, it's logically impossible for nature to produce lightning. I mean, obviously we can't prove that's false. It's a valid argument saying that it's logically impossible. Lightning is produced by natural things. Lightning is produced, therefore supernatural did it, or something like that. It's a perfectly valid argument. But we can't prove it's unsound until we do the scientific experiment. We can't differentiate this argument from being imagination or reality without the empirical verification. So even in using the law of non-contradiction as a basis for your argument, the arguments themselves can have a valid structure, but there's no way to demonstrate soundness. There's no way to differentiate imagination from reality just based off of the law of non-contradiction. It's the analytic-synthetic distinction. We can only get to the fact that this is a valid argument. We can never get to the fact that it's a sound argument.
Well, see, and that's where I would just disagree. I think if the argument from proportionate causality for consciousness and life, if those things actually were supported by the law of non-contradiction, that there was a logical contradiction, then that would be good reason for thinking those things. But I don't think they actually are supported by the law of non-contradiction. So I would say that they don't work on that basis. But if they did, I would support them. So that's where I think we just have to look at the arguments.
Right, but I don't see any difference between their argument and your argument.
Right. Well, and that's where we have a disagreement. But the difference is there is no logical contradiction in something producing a feature that it doesn't have. Okay, but this argument against life or consciousness not coming from non-life or non-consciousness, it's trading on that being a logical contradiction, but I think it makes a mistake. But I do think there's a logical contradiction in the deepest possible dimension of reality not attaining deeper possible dimensions. And a lone particle, would not attain those deeper possible dimensions. And that's where the contradiction comes in my mind.
Right, but I'm saying like just how you say that it's a logical contradiction in your mind. I mean, in the idealist mind, because I talked to a few of them, they really truly believe it's a logical contradiction for consciousness to come from non-consciousness. They can't imagine a possible way that they're the same. They think they're categorically different, like the square root of a pork chop. There's a logical contradiction with trying to square root a pork chop because they're categorically different things. And the idealist thinks that consciousness is a categorically different thing from non-consciousness. And so in their mind, it's a logical contradiction. But if something's a logical contradiction in your mind, but we later discovered it actually isn't a contradiction at all, like philosophers used to criticize Einstein by saying space-time can't bend because time isn't a physical thing. Obviously, time can't bend. That's silly. There's a logical contradiction there, just like the square root of a pork chop. And so when we actually discovered, oh, wait, time can bend, what that meant was that their use of the law of non-contradiction was actually just an argument from incredulity. It was a god of the gaps, essentially. They just said, it's logically impossible for us to imagine it, therefore it's impossible about reality. And it seems to me like the same thing could be true of your argument. It's logically contradiction in the way you imagine it, but it may not be in reality. And there doesn't seem to be any distinguishing factor between those two possibilities.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, that idealist argument, I would just say they're just wrong. And I mean, if their argument worked, then I would become an idealist, perhaps. I mean, if it truly worked, I would. I don't think it works. And basically, it sounds like they're arguing from proportionate causality, which, like substance dualists and some others argue from that as well. I used to find that point pretty plausible, except I don't think that it actually rests on the law of non-contradiction. So that's where it's just like, I mean, if I can be talked out of it, I can be talked out of it if I can be shown the argument doesn't. And I know that you're not convinced that it does, but I'm not convinced that it doesn't rest on the law of non-contradiction. However, I just blinked out. Oh yeah, but there was a point. So you like to argue the problem of evil, for example, at least from what I've heard. To me, that rests on an intuition based on the law of non-contradiction. It seems like you apply it to the concrete world. Now, I don't think the problem of evil does successfully go through, but that's another debate. But
Actually,
how would you distinguish that?
That's a really good example, because that is a lot like the argument I'm making, is so that it would be a logical contradiction for an all-good God who doesn't want evil or suffering or whatever to create a world that has suffering. That's a logical contradiction. Now, you can make the argument that, well, maybe there's some sufficient reason, but I'm still going to say, no, that's a logical contradiction. So obviously God can't exist. Now, of course, we just disagree on this fact, but is there a way to like prove one way or the other which one's right, which one's not right? That's kind of the same thing I'm asking about your argument, is that you have a position, you think it's a logical contradiction for the deepest level of reality to not have maximal properties or whatever. And I'm saying, well, there could just be some sufficient reason that it doesn't, essentially. Like there's a particle possibility, or a one with other properties, or one with less properties. And all of those are some sufficient reason for the same reason the problem of evil doesn't work in the theistic mindset. So, I mean, would you say that the problem of evil proves God doesn't exist?
All right, so I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, so this is where 2 points. I think that with any philosophical point, one should have epistemic humility. So I wouldn't say for a philosophical argument, oh, this seals the deal, time to go home, because it is possible that an argument is wrong. There have been arguments I found convincing that I changed my mind on it, many times. But if I find an argument to be plausible, in that moment, I think I'm justified in finding it and being convinced by that argument. Now, I should still be open to the possibility that I could be persuaded otherwise. I think somebody could be justified in being persuaded by the problem of evil, even though it is epistemically possible they could be wrong about it. Now, the difference is a couple of points. One, I find skeptical theism, so the idea that God would have morally justified reasons that go beyond our understanding and so on, I find that to be more likely, more plausible than you may argue like a skeptical lone particleism or whatever to undermine this argument. And that's based on an intuition, but I find that to be more plausible. But I also have a worked out theodicy that I think undercuts the logical contradiction of the problem of evil. Now, that's going to be a whole nother debate. I don't want to get into it. Maybe another time I'd love to, but that's its own debate. But that would be how I would adjudicate. So I have a response to the problem of evil, and even if I don't, to me, skeptical theism seems more plausible than. So anyways, that's how I would go about it, though.
Yeah, but would you say it would be fair for the physicists to say the same thing about the particle, that they have a theodicy of the particle, that they have a fleshed out model of reality that they can say to reject your idea that there is a logical contradiction, there being a deeper level in some kind? Couldn't they say the same thing?
They could, but it doesn't necessarily mean I would be convinced by it, because from what I'm looking at physics, like they're coming up with a mathematical model, at least as far as I can tell. And that's fine for describing the way that physics behaves. But I don't know that it's in a place to tell us what the fundamental nature of reality is. Now, if they're convinced by their lone particle theory, I can't enter their mind and say, maybe if I did enter their mind, I'd be like, wow, that works. But until I'm convinced by it, I'm going to stick with what I find to be most plausible, just like, with any argument. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm not saying they aren't rationally justified, but I don't know if that makes me not rationally justified because I'm not convinced by what's being suggested until I hear it. But to me, it does seem like a logical contradiction to deny the argument.
So if we think about it from an outsider perspective, we have two models. One is yours that uses intuition as your basis. You say intuition gives us a way to tell us about the fundamental nature of reality. And then the physicist who says math gives us a way to tell us about the fundamental nature of reality. Do you think it seems more reasonable to follow the physicist in the math or the intuition?
Well, I would say with mine, it's based on intuition about the nature of the law of non-contradiction and how it applies to reality. And I think that is a better guide to telling us about the nature of reality than math would be. Now, if we're talking about calculating something like motions and the Big Bang and things like that physicists do, then math is going to an observation, whatever else they use, is going to be experimentation. So it's going to be a better guide because it's better suited to that. But if I'm wanting to figure out what is the fundamental nature of reality, yeah, I'm going to go with intuition and logic. Yeah.
Because the way I see it, it seems like when we apply intuition, it fails pretty consistently about things like lightning or tornadoes, all those different examples. But math works on those really, really well. So if we think like starting from the like I think therefore I am or whatever and expanding outwards, what can our intuition give us an accurate description about reality? How far does it apply? Like it applies to how people interact, where dogs are, what people are allergic to, whatever, just things in our everyday life. But that's where it seems to end. Like that's as far as intuition can take us as being a reasonable basis of knowledge. Whereas math can take us to the moon, literally, and beyond. Math gives us information about billions of years in the past accurately. So it seems like if we're using these two tools, the intuition versus the math seems to just crush intuition without any comparison. Like it wins, like by far. So it seems to me from the outside perspective that based on these two models, we should probably go with the math on whichever one, if we're betting on which one's going to more likely to tell us about the ground of ultimate reality.
Yeah, I just don't know how we're going to use math to tap into I mean, I agree. If we're talking about like observations, calculating, the orbit of the moon and so on, then yeah, math is going to be our guide because it's measuring, we're using it to measure interactions. But I don't know. And the thing is, when we're talking about events happening within the universe, we're going to have to do some empirical measurement. But because there's always going to be logically possible explanations. Did it come from this cause? Did it come from that cause? We're not going to be able to apply intuition and the laws of logic. But if I'm pinning down what is the ultimate nature of something, and I have I'm going to arrive at a logical contradiction if I don't accept that it's X, I see that as very justified. And I don't know how math is going to help us out there either.
Well, I kind of see that both. I think that intuition and math, neither one can tell us about the ultimate fundamental nature of reality. I think they're both incapable of doing that. But when I look at them as tools, intuition is a very limited tool, like a hammer. It can only be used to do so many things. It's not extremely useful when we're trying to build an airplane. You can't build an airplane with a hammer. It's not enough tools. But math is a much more versatile tool. It can be used for a lot more things than our intuition can. It seems to be a much more reliable basis to ground knowledge claims on than our intuition. And that seems to be the fundamental difference between your position and my position, is that I think that going with like essentially the physicist position, because it is grounded in that tool that we know works really, really well, like in all facets of reality, versus yours seems to leverage on intuition. Like, I mean, I grant the law of non-contradiction. I think logic is perfectly good, but the intuition part seems to be a big weakness to your position that I don't think the physicist position or the atheist position has.
Sure. Well, okay. Well, let me ask you this, because this was something I had asked you in the past that, okay, like the cogito, ergo sum, like it seemed that you've based that in the past based on empirical data, but I would base that on the law of non-contradiction, because I would say if I don't exist, there's a logical contradiction for me to doubt my own existence. Would you agree that that's a successful application of the law of non-contradiction to establish the existence of something?
No, I don't think so. Like, because the way I use the cogito is that I experience existence. So I exist. And then I use the argument, I think, therefore I am, to describe my existence. Like, this is a cup. This is a cup. Now, the English language is required. I have to presuppose the English language to express the fact that this is a cup. But the cup exists regardless of whether or not I use the English language. So I don't need to presuppose English for the cup to exist. And likewise, I don't need to presuppose logic or the law of non-contradiction for me to exist. I exist regardless of the logic, regardless of the argument. So even though I need to presuppose logic to form the argument, I think therefore I am, the argument itself is irrelevant. I exist before the argument does. So my existence isn't contingent on the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction just describes the fact that I exist.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. But I think that if I were to say, well, maybe I can doubt my own existence and I not exist, like I'm going to think, no, that violates the law of non-contradiction. So like that's where it's not that the law of non-contradiction enforces my existence. It's that if I were to deny the cogito argument, it would commit me to an obvious contradiction. And I go, yeah, that can't be the case. So to me, it does seem like a successful use, not because it's prescriptive, but because it's successfully descriptive.
Oh, right. Yeah. So if your argument is that you can use a logical contradiction, like this cup exists and it can't exist and not exist, therefore it exists or something, like we could use that to show the validity of the existence of the cup. But we couldn't get to the soundness. It would be impossible to do that because of the analytic synthetic distinction. We can use the law of non-contradiction as a way to describe the existence of things, but we can't ever use the law of non-contradiction to indicate the existence of a particular thing.
Okay, so I'm roughly familiar with the analytic synthetic distinction, but why can't you get to the existence of something? Like why does that distinction mean you can't get to the existence of something with the law of non-contradiction?
Well, it's like if I say A cannot be A and not A at the same time, that means A and A is there, or hypothetically. But that doesn't show us what A is. Like, does A exist? Well, maybe, maybe not. Like, this is just the argument is valid, but it doesn't say A exists. It doesn't say A is physical or mental. It doesn't say anything about A. It's a hypothetical. So analytic things are just things true by definition, and synthetic things are things that we can verify essentially. I forget exactly what the definition is, but so just using analytic logic, we could just make a completely coherent logical argument, but we can never say an apple exists. There's no way to get from logic to this apple exists. You would need somewhere in the argument, there's going to need to be, there is an empirical evidence of this apple somewhere. There can't, just using pure logic, you can't get to X exists.
Okay, so my understanding, I could be totally wrong here, but analytic means like the words or definitions itself entail its conclusion, but like a synthetic is something where that's not the case, but it could still be true. Like grass is green as a synthetic truth, but it's not an analytic truth. Like there are no married bachelors.
Right.
So I agree that you can't, there's no argument I could use for a cup, but I don't know that that's true in principle. Just nobody's come up with a good one. I don't think they could. But for my own existence, so like the cogito, the way I understand it is I exist, and I can doubt my own existence, but there's a logical contradiction there. So working from the experience, so you're working from something concrete, and then you're using the law of non-contradiction. So I think that is an example where you can use the law of non-contradiction analytically to arrive at the existence. I think that's the only thing. And of course, I like my argument for God, but I think those are the only two that I know of where you could use the law of non-contradiction to argue for a concrete thing. Now, other stuff,
well,
I think you could.
So because
okay,
for me, the cogito one doesn't argue for concrete existence. You already exist, and the law of non-contradiction is again just describing that. You can't use the law of non-contradiction to come to your existence. You already exist. So that
you have an experience of your existence. So yeah, there is the experience, but the radical doubt, and there's nobody holds to this because it's so obviously contradictory, right? But you say there is this conscious experience of existence, but the radical skeptic says, yeah, but I could be tricked. Maybe I don't exist. But then Descartes or whoever comes back with, yeah, but that's a logical contradiction. And even the radical skeptic's not going to deny that. So it's using the law of non-contradiction to substantiate that your experience does entail your existence after all. But I don't know. That's how I size it up there, though.
Yeah, I don't understand how that argument justifies the belief in a concrete thing, because the experience does that already. You already have that empirical verification, like saying this cup exists. We can then use the law of non-contradiction to then reinforce the fact the cup exists. But the way we know the cup exists isn't from the logic. It's from the fact I'm holding a cup. So if we're referring to any existing thing in the world, you need that kind of empirical basis or whatever to justify that thing's existence. You can't do it with just the logic. There's no way to get from just logic to X exists. You need that other empirical thing always. And we have that in the case of the cogito, is because we experience it. But I don't think you could ever get from just logic to something exists.
So radical skeptic's going to say there is no existence. There's just the experience of existence. And of course, that just seems like an immediate contradiction. But that's I have a disagreement there. But I really think that it's because the radical skeptic is arguing that an experience may not be existent. And it's like, well, that's contradictory. But that's where it is resting on the law of non-contradiction after all, I think.
Well, that's going the other way with the argument. So again, the fact that we have an experience, we have some synthetic interaction with the world, is what makes that belief justified. It's not the logic. Whether or not you can try to do it secondarily, that's fine. But there isn't a case where you can get that justification purely with the logic. You need that initial thing first, and then adding the logic can make it better or worse or whatever. You can be like a skeptic and say we have the initial experience, and then try to reject that using logic. But you still need that experience to exist first. You can't do it without that. You need that thing to be there. And so I don't think you can ever use just logic without that experience to ever get to anything exists.
So I'm kind of inclined to agree with you. I think you need some connection to something concrete. And that's why I don't accept the ontological argument, because I think it's just these floating propositions and they're not connected to anything concrete. So we might agree, but I would say it is resting on the law of non-contradiction when it's applied to concrete reality. But you do need something concrete. Now, I agree if you were to say, well, you can't have something concrete unless it exists. I totally agree, except that I think that that assumes the law of non-contradiction. But
I mean, yeah, I would agree. But again, the point would be is that it seems to be the case that you haven't presented that. All you've presented is the analytic argument, just like the ontological argument. It doesn't seem like you've grounded it in anything that actually exists other than an analogy, which all the different worldviews can use. And so the only resting fact that supports your conclusion is your intuition. And again, the intuition doesn't seem to work because we have lots of intuitions that seem to fail. And the other models that use like math seems to be a much better tool. Essentially, that would be essentially the summary of my position.
okay. Well, I'll just follow up and then I got to go in a minute. But I would say that where I do think the analogy works is because I am starting with something concrete. I'm saying there are existing things and that those exist, so deeper possible dimensions. So that is where you're getting that concrete connection. And then, so it's not like the ontological argument where I'm just analyzing these propositions and they have no causal connection with concrete reality. And you may disagree with me here, but I think that there is a causal connection, and that's where I think that the building analogy does help flesh out the argument.
Yeah, well, awesome. Well, it was a really interesting conversation. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. I'm happy to talk with you later.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. All right. Well, I'd love to talk about the problem of evil sometime. So.
Sure.
Yep. All right. Thanks. I'll see you.